Can you take a few minutes to introduce yourself and this report, and maybe why the Council on Foreign Relations wrote this report, what the genesis was, and what you hope the impact will be?
I'm Peter Segal. I direct the Digital and Cyberspace Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. CFR is a nonpartisan, independent foreign policy think tank, so take no official positions and no U.S. government or any other government money. The task force was created, which meant that we had two outside chairs and then a group of about 25 people on the task force with various backgrounds from the private sector, former members of the intelligence community, some people from the Defense Department and other parts of the U.S. government. And the goal, I think, really was to kind of acknowledge that the world has changed quite dramatically. The council had done a task force on cyber policy 10 years ago. That report is very optimistic. That report is called Defending the Open and Global Internet, and was very much filled with kind of visions of both the economic and social political advantages that an open global internet brought. And this report, I think, very much says, well, the last 10 years haven't gone exactly as we expected. Lots of countries are controlling content, controlling the internet, fragmenting, asking for data to be stored locally. Cybersecurity risks are increasing. We see the big four nation states, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, still being very active, but we also see a new threat in ransomware gangs. And so the U.S. really kind of has to admit that reality and think about how it wants to shape its foreign policy in cyberspace to address it.
Right. So I want to make sure that we're defining the terms so that everyone is on the same page, because not everyone is a cyber person. So when you say open internet, I know you were alluding to some countries and nations controlling and fragmenting the internet. So how does the average US person view the internet? What is an open internet versus controlled or fragmented or not open?
Yeah, I think we can think about it at probably a couple of layers. So if we think about the content on the internet, what you read or what you see, the internet from the beginning has been slightly fragmented, right? The Chinese from the day that they connected to the internet said there's some types of information we're going to keep out because it threatens domestic stability and regime legitimacy. Iran did the same thing. And even in France and Germany, there were certain types of Nazi paraphernalia or anti-Semitic things you couldn't say online. The U.S. is unique because of the First Amendment and then our commitment to free speech, that we had the kind of most open internet on the content side. Then on the kind of services and software side, that and data side, that's been growing. So again, China was a leader in this. It blocked U.S. companies from participating in the domestic space if they didn't follow Chinese rules. So, what we saw over time were companies like Google and Yahoo and others having to leave the China market because they were being asked to censor or turn over data on Chinese citizens. But over time, we're now seeing more and more countries thinking about who the software providers are. India blocked TikTok after the border dispute. U.S. is thinking, should it block TikTok because of national security concerns? And so we're seeing more countries think about supply chain security. We're also seeing more countries think about content moderation, right? What kind of things we want to keep up or take down? And we're having a very vigorous debate in the United States about extremist content and how do we what the responsibilities of the government are and what the tech sectors are. So that I would say is the second which is growing at a relatively fast pace. And then finally, there's we can think of a fragmentation about the pipes or the kind of technological infrastructure, and that actually isn't happening very quickly, right? We still are pretty much all operating under the same protocols, and the internet still connects to each other, but there are some moves to split off, right? So Russia experimented with its own DNS system to basically shut off its own internet. China seems to be experimenting with some new standards. So that could be the future as we kind of move into an even more fragmented internet.
Interesting. So going back to the threats in cyberspace, and your report talks about nation state threats and how those are primarily responsible for attacks on the supply chain, but then you also talk about ransomware. The threat of ransomware, and are those separate from nation state threats? And if they are, who's conducting the ransomware attacks, and why is it not nation states?
Yeah, I mean, there's a Venn diagram of overlap. I mean, the nation states, I think, come into it in at least two ways. The first is some of the ransomware groups, especially in Russia, also have connections to the Russian state, either the Russian intelligence agencies or other parts of the Russian state, and they generally, in some cases, they may have been tasked to do things by Russian operators. More likely, it seems as if they're given safe haven. The rule seems to be for lots of Russian cyber criminals is as long as you don't conduct attacks on Russian targets, we're going to turn a blind eye, and you can pretty much do what you want. And so, what we've seen, I think, for example, with the Colonial Pipeline attack or JBS Meats or others, Russian ransomware groups operating in Russia, Russian government is not going to give us any assistance there. Now, there is a fear that as the war between Russia and Ukraine keeps going, that as the Russian government is more damaged by economic sanctions and other economic tools, that it would unleash the ransomware groups on U.S. targets. That hasn't happened yet, but it is something that I think is in the back of mind of people.
Yeah, I was going to ask: are the goals of ransomware attack inherently different than the traditional nation state attacks? Right? Like, is the goal of ransomware to earn money or to disrupt, or a little bit of both? Is that why Russia is okay with the ransomware groups doing it?
Yeah, the vast majority is to make money, and again, nation state actors could be behind that. We see, North Korea has really adopted that as a way to try to get around sanctions and raise money for the regime. There do seem to be other cases, where ransomware attacks are, as you said, are the objective is disruptive, or in some cases, kind of distraction. So you do a ransomware attack. The defender is spending all their time trying to, bring the system back up, and there may be another espionage attack that state actors are conducting on. So I think it has both. I think the vast majority of what we've seen so far is for financial gain.
So, what is the current recommendation? Like, I know the FBI the government wants you to report ransomware. Is the current trend to just pay the ransomware to get back online? Is it to call the FBI and do the traditional, hostage negotiation tactic? Like, what are the vast majority of companies doing when they're, victim of a ransomware attack?
Yeah, I don't think we don't really know, right? Because the questions about how many companies reported it or just pay it themselves. Actually, it's good timing for this. I saw that the Financial Times today had a little toy on their website about you could try to negotiate with a ransomware gang. I haven't done it yet, but you try to see, can you keep the ransomware low, and when will they decrypt your data? The government has basically said, please tell us about it. I think partly that just has to do so we have a scope of the issue. there are some actors, it is illegal to pay the ransomware, especially those that are tied to the Korean state or the Iranian state. So you can get yourself into trouble there.
How are you supposed to know where your ransomware is from?
You don't know for sure, but if it's so some groups, I guess, identify themselves and you would know, but you would still not be 100% sure. I think there's been a lot of mixed messaging about should you pay, shouldn't you pay. I think a lot of people pay because even if you do have the backups and everything else, the costs of getting it back online are pretty high.
So, and there's no guarantee that once you're subject to a ransomware attack that you're going to get all of your data back, right? Like, aren't there varying levels of how good they don't care if they decrypt your data. They just want your money, right? So they are not invested in.
Yeah, but the most kind of professional ones do care because they have a kind of a service reputation to hold up. And okay. I mean, those are the ones that have help wanted, help service lines you can call and everything else. So I would say that the most professional ones do in fact care. We're seeing a kind of a two-step now. It's not only encrypting the data, but also doxing the data. So they will take the data and release it publicly to try to create more pressure on companies to pay out.
Why would a company pay after they've been doxed like that?
Well, because it's, there's still some data being held, and it's trying to embarrass the company and release sensitive data. And
do you have any insights into the preferred targets or what the trend in targets is currently? Because I imagine it shifts over time as certain industries get wise.
Yeah, so it's actually shifting away from bigger players like Pipeline and others because it attracted so much political attention and the possible U.S. response to smaller players. We still see that schools, local school districts are a very popular target. Hospitals also, but at a smaller scale as opposed to like the NHS or system-wide.
That makes sense. So let's talk about the nation state threats, right? The actual countries out there and how they're going after, our DoD supply chain and other sensitive non-government information. How did we just notice this? Have they been doing this the whole time? You have some metrics in your report. Can you talk about the research that you did into the nation states going after the supply chain specifically?
Yeah, I mean, they've been doing this, cyber attacks on U.S. government and U.S. private sector networks for a long time. The vast majority of those attacks are, data theft and espionage. Mm-hmm. There has been a long distinction between, Chinese actors being more willing to steal private sector intellectual property and business secrets for competitive gain, but all four of those countries, they're basically spying. Like the U.S. conducts similar operations, they're also spying. It's hard to get a metric on if they're going up, they're going down, just because much of it has to do about public reporting and attribution, and when do we find the attackers in the networks. We're seeing we have seen some. The high-profile attacks on supply chain in the sense of, software updates and things with SolarWinds, right, which was a Russian, very sophisticated and widespread Russian attack. But the Chinese have also increasingly focused on IT services and cloud providers and others as a way of getting into network.
And is it just China, because you said that the major four, China, Russia, DPRK, and Iran, is China is it like overwhelmingly China and the others are just a little bit, or is there just so much going on and China is just the largest player? And are they working together? Do they have any aligned goals?
Yeah. On the sheer number, hard to say. Rob Joyce, who was at the NSA, kind of once described the difference between China and Russia as the Russians are like a tsunami and the Chinese are climate change. So kind of, the Russians can be, very high profile case, very disruptive. But if we look long-term trends, it's really the Chinese that are shaping the internet and cyberspace to US effects. The most recent, national threat intelligence from the IC list China and Russia as the top two, but basically says that China is the most widespread and persistent threat. So I would suspect that means number-wise. We don't see a lot of cooperation on operations, right? Because we're talking about most of these operations are done by intelligence services, which are distrustful of each other as well. China and Russia supposedly signed a pact that said they wouldn't hack each other, but they continue to hack each other and try to find out information about each other. There is cooperation between China and Russia on kind of the first topic we were talking about, information control, and how do you stop the flow of free information and things like that. The North Koreans, they were for a while operating from parts of China. If you remember the Sony attack, those attackers were coming out of China. They were in Shenyang in the north. And they were mainly reliant on Chinese cables until the Russians built a cable also for the North Koreans. But the North Koreans now, mainly operate in other countries, in Malaysia, Indonesia, and some other places. So we don't see a huge amount of cooperation there.
Interesting. So a lot of the work that I do involves like defending against or, implementing controls to prevent attacks. But your report is meant to provide, recommendations for foreign relations, right? For policy recommendations so that the government can help protect, U.S. companies and the DoD and federal supply chain. You referenced a layered approach to policy, and coincidentally, this morning I went to a different think tank where Senator King and Representative Gallagher from the Solarium Commission 2.0, their new report is out, and so they also address a layered approach. Can you talk about what a layered approach is to deterrence or prevention of cyber crime?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. We kind of, as the Council on Foreign Relations, really focused on foreign policy aspects of it. And Solarium Commission that you mentioned, did lots of great suggestions on kind of domestic regulation and threat sharing. We don't. It is a similar approach to what the Solarium Commission is calling a layered approach, because there is a kind of long-standing, not very useful debate in cyber kind of policy about does deterrence work, right? And because in the conventional and the nuclear world, right, how do we defend or coerce another power is through this idea of deterrence. We hold, things of value at risk. We retaliate quickly. The adversary knows we're going to retaliate quickly, and so that affects their decision making, and that doesn't seem to hold in cyber for a range of reasons, right? Attribution takes time, it's slow. Often it's not clear what the punishment is. There could be a cyber attack and retaliation, but we might not know about it. And most of the cyber operations that we're talking about are below the threshold for use of force or an armed attack, right? They're spying, and spying itself is against domestic law and annoying, but it's not against international law. And it's something the U.S. does, right? And the U.S. is going to continue to do. So,
what?
Yes.
No, not at all.
So the issue has been, deterrence doesn't seem to work in cyberspace, right? We're talking about all these actions below the threshold and use of force. The report, and I think the Cyber Solarium Commission and others basically say that's essentially true, but for attacks above the threshold, there probably is a type of deterrence, right? The Russians and Chinese do seem to be deterred for destructive cyber attacks, right? Mm-hmm. They probably are thinking twice about a cyber attack that turns the power out or causes a chemical factory to explode or something. So that aside, putting the kind of higher level deterrence aside, if you think about below the threshold, what do you have to do? And then you need a whole bunch of things. The most important thing is just getting better at defending. So that means, information sharing and resilience and all the things that, controls and all the things that you're talking about. And that means in the private sector and the public sector. It means increasingly the U.S. has adopted what's known as kind of defending forward or hunting forward. So taking a more offensive oriented view of defense. So the best thing to do is try to prevent the attackers before they ever get to U.S. networks, which means taking down their infrastructure or other types of disruption, usually on third country networks. So, if they've taken over, routers or servers in some other country, can you work with that country to help take them down? And we've seen in over the last kind of year and a half, the U.S. has sent these hunt forward teams to Ukraine and Macedonia and other Baltic and Eastern European states to kind of help combat Russian operations. In many cases, it seems to be exposing malware before the Russians get a chance to use it. So kind of finding those secrets and exposing them. And then, so disruption, defense, and then on top of that, a kind of trying to shape the international environment by setting the rules of the road or the norms of behavior. So some discussions in the UN and indictments and sanctions and working with other partners to try and shape behavior that way.
So what I hear you saying is that the best defense for these like below the threshold of responses from our federal government, for these small businesses where they're getting attacked on a regular basis, they're below the threshold. Right now, the best, I guess, hope for their defense is really foreign policy to try to for like foreign policy, but also these. It's very weird because these small attacks are very tactical in nature, but the deterrence and the prevention are these like strategic initiatives, right, that take a long time to implement, but they're still getting attacked every single day. And so I think I don't know if a lot of these small companies realize how difficult it is for our government to provide the same protection that they provide to brick and mortar companies, right, every day, just by virtue of being in the United States. Yeah. They're protected, but it's completely different in cyberspace.
Yeah, essentially, if you're a small company, you're on your own. I mean, the U.S. government cannot really defend you. I mean, the U.S. government has 16 sectors that are considered critical sectors, right? And DHS, Department of Homeland Service, Security is supposed to help with defend there. But mostly that has to do with information sharing and kind of some threat intel and some monitoring of very critical networks. But for the most part, as you said, small companies are on their own, and so that means yes, you have to be able to kind of like if you're facing a nation state, then you're going to be in big trouble. There's not really much that a private company over the long term can do against a nation state.
And why? Yeah. Can you help talk about why a nation state would target a small business? Like, what is why are they going after these small businesses?
Yeah, I think for the vast majority of small businesses, they're being targeted by cyber criminals, not by nation states. I think, if you're a small business in specific, increasingly strategic technologies, artificial intelligence or new sources of electricity or new batteries or those types of things, you probably will be targeted by Chinese hackers. And those firms, they're starting to get more briefings and starting to get more reach out by the intelligence communities. If you're you're producing furniture, your biggest risk is going to be ransomware. It's not from nation state attacker. So I think it really just depends on the sector and kind of connections to Chinese strategic concerns.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And most of the people that we're trying to reach with, this message are within the defense industrial base. And I think just by virtue of being in the DoD supply chain, that inherently makes them a potential target, right? Even if they're small companies, because they do have even just a small bit of the big picture of information.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're, if you're in the DIB or you're a DIB supplier, then you are, probably underneath the umbrella, and it depends how far, if you're a second or third removed supplier, then the issue becomes, I think, probably more difficult. But yes, that increasingly, I think most of that supply chain is aware of and cognizant of the nation state threat.
The DoD has been talking about these threats to the supply chain for years, and have these acquisition clauses that go into all contracts to mandate cybersecurity controls, and companies haven't been doing it, so now they're going to implement third-party assurance. But no one ever talks about the actual threat. They say it's happening, but no one's ever shown or talked about or explained what the actual threat is. So I think most of the defense industrial base, they're either they have enough money, they have cybersecurity because they have IP and they protect it, or they think they're too small, or they can't afford it, they don't understand it, and they don't know what to do. So I think hearing the legitimate threat from someone like you and explaining that we're trying, the government's trying to fix it, but they can't defend everybody in the same way that they protected our physical security,
Yeah, and there's some private sector companies that we have no idea will be a target, but they could be, right? I mean, I would have never thought that Sony would have become a national security interest, but with the dictator and the free speech issues that came up around it, then it became a national security issue.
Yeah.
So you can imagine that there's, that we always kind of picture these attacks on, Raytheon or the U.S. government or a chemical factory blowing up, but it could be, some sector we haven't even thought about.
Yeah, no, solid point. Or out of retaliation for offending somebody, and now you're your target.
Thanks for watching Defense TechCast, your deep dive into CMMC, CUI, and all of the cybersecurity hot topics affecting the defense space today. Brought to you by clearancejobs.com and with host Leslie Weinstein, a cyber expert and U.S. Army major. Subscribe to this page to be sure you can catch the next episode.